Lake City Council briefing session this afternoon. Council members, I want to draw your attention to agenda item number 1, which is a written briefing. It's informational about the housing report for 2016. I think, council members, do we have any council members that have questions about the housing report?
My computer is, my annotation notes in the system are arriving. I think
Currently arriving. Do any other council members have questions about the written briefing on the annual housing report?
Thank you.
Then we'll wait for a second, because we have a whole group of tech support people over here. If anybody is wondering what's going on over there, they're helping us make sure we can get through our software agenda items.
So there's nobody at the desk, but should I just talk through it?
I think Nick's going to join us.
Nick, I will speak in your direction then.
Oh, and Melissa, and we'll have some administrative staff, so.
Yeah, we do have administrative staff here.
Could I get you all to introduce
Thank you.
yourselves and your titles too, please?
Melissa Jensen, Director, Housing and Neighborhood Development.
Sean Murphy, Housing Policy Manager.
Thank you, Sean, Melissa, and Nick. And I have questions on this. I thought it was a really interesting report, and the reason I wanted to bring them up in the meeting is because I think they absolutely pertain to other discussions we're about to have in our agenda and our continued housing and affordable housing meetings, which are basically going to happen until the end of the year. So on page 4, it talks about, and I'm thinking the numbers may just be messed up, but that the significant projects table shows that 771 housing units were recently completed, and of those, 1,033 units are designated for 31 to 80% AMI. Are those numbers inversed? Because it sounds like 1,000 units of 700 units.
That's a very good question.
You can get back with me, because also the 1,033.
It's a little bit different. The recently completed list the numbers actually are correct. The recently completed list is just those that are completed. The 1,000 units of affordability are either permitted, the affordability has been applied for, and the funding has been approved. But
So
those are not recently completed. That's true. Those
are of the
units
52
are sort of
units.
in the pipeline,
Okay.
whether they're recently completed or coming online.
Got you. So we're saying that about 1/5 of the units in that pipeline are known to be in creation are affordable housing. And my next question is about that ratio 1 to 5. Is that similar? Are we seeing a change in the ratio of the uninfluenced affordable housing development in the city?
Do you mean, are these market rate developers that are now doing affordable units?
I'm asking, yeah, that ratio, if we looked at our housing reports from 15 and earlier, mostly in the last few years, are we seeing that 1 to 5 ratio increase, or is it changing at all?
Not with the types of developers. Primarily, we're still seeing it just among those who do affordability. I think it relates more to their access to the Salt Lake City market in particular, where we've seen an uptick. So, and then also the viability of 4% markets, where in 4% tax credits, where in 2015, those weren't really a viable option for developers, but because of the nature of interest rates, so it helped us sort of increase the affordability that we were doing.
So what I'm hoping, and when we get into the Grow Salt Lake, is that we have a mechanism to have a hand on that lever of the pipeline projects coming through. If we see a 1 to 5 ratio of affordable housing units in the natural pipeline, and let's say we want to see 2 to 5, we want to see 2,000 units for every 5,000 units next year. I'm going to be looking for the mechanisms for us to affect that normal pipeline of not city-inspired projects, but
Sure.
normal market projects.
And I think that the idea of mechanisms or tools to try to impact the ratio makes complete sense. One of the things that we won't be able to dictate is what the private market is going to do with the first part of that ratio. So the stimulation and the desire to build market rate for developers who build market rate exclusively isn't something that we're going to be able to adjust. What we can focus on is how much of the developers who build affordable, because it does seem to be a fairly consistent pool of developers who are building affordable, how much they might be able to. But our ability to impact the builders of market rate that would be a very different policy
Right.
direction.
And there's benefit to the natural course of market saturation of units, period, right? That we're not talking about. So my next question's on page 5 in that little pull-out box at the bottom where it says it's important to note that these surveys are exclusively conducted by firms serving an investor clientele that focus on downtown core buildings 1 to 5 years old and contain a minimum of 50 units. And I just wanted clarity on whether or not all of these vacancy rates and rent rates that we're looking at are downtown centric, or if we're pulling from smaller and less new rental research also.
Yeah, and I think there's a bit of a misnomer in vacancy rate research nationwide. It's almost exclusively vacancy rates, when they're talked about in any market, deal with relatively new construction. So here, the studies that are done for the Salt Lake market, the person who does that research basically focuses on projects that were built in the last 5 years, projects that have 50 units or more, and projects that are in the CBD. And that is really what our 2.7 in this report. There was also just the new updated 2.6 report that came out, also I believe from the same source. And it's very difficult. We don't have any mechanism, we don't have any survey, we don't have any approach for the much older housing stock that is on the rental market that is scattered all throughout the city. So those numbers focus on recent construction downtown.
And
then
that
from
54% of renters and 46% owners, is that also based on the same downtown
That's citywide.
research?
That one is citywide. That comes from federal data. That's
Okay.
HUD and ACS data.
Okay, that's really interesting that our ability to understand what's not happening in the CBD, that's not a brand new big project, is fairly limited.
I think that one of the reasons that they go that route, and Jim Woods is the one that just did the most recent survey, and it was 85 different buildings that he contacted, and they use that as sort of a strength of the overall market. It does tend to give us an indication of how the rest of the housing market is doing, and while it's not exact, if you have higher vacancy rates among new development, and those are often the most sought after, then you could assume that the vacancy rates would go up from there as we expand out.
My last question is about it's under the market shortfalls portion, and it talks about our population growth, but the home price is growing at 4 times as fast as the wages. Can you tell us more about a little bit about how we measure that? And I believe we're on par with the national trend in that regard, but if I'm wrong, I'd like to know that.
And Salt Lake really is having the same impact that cities throughout the country are, that wage growth just is not keeping up with inflation and the cost of goods really across the board.
This is remarkable, and some of us have talked about this as we put sometimes what feels like a myopic focus on adjusting affordable housing opportunities without really expanding the reality of what needs to be our vision, that without an increase to wages, we are only addressing a portion of the housing crisis. And I understand that as a municipal entity, we don't, especially in Utah, we can't set a minimum wage here unless if I'm wrong, we need to have another conversation. But this is a really critical piece of information that I know the Director Fritz in Economic Development has talked about doing analysis of how the city can convene dialogue between employers and education centers about what is your gap and how can our universities and colleges and technical schools train people to fill those employment positions. But this is really astonishing. And that's my last bit. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Mendenhall. Thank you both, Sean and Melissa and Nick. Our next item on our agenda is item number 2. It's our General Fund Capital Improvement Projects follow-up briefing. This is probably going to be a very short briefing. Ben, could you just bring us up to date with where we are and what our expectations are for today?
The council is scheduled to vote on 2 CIP items tonight. The first is the adoption of the project-specific allocations for the CIP budget, and the second item is the update to the 1999 CIP and debt management resolution that was discussed at the last 2 briefings.
Thank you for joining us, Mike Ackerlow.
You're welcome. Good afternoon.
There are a couple updates for the council today. The first are some revisions to the mayor's funding recommendations. You might recall that we received updated available to spend impact fee numbers that resulted in the original set of recommendations being beyond the budget that we had. These are summarized in the chart on page 2 and on the big screen in the corner. As a result of the changes, there are just over $240,000 in general fund money that does not have a recommendation from the administration for how to spend. And I'll quickly walk you through what the revisions are. The first project is number 2, citywide off-leash dog park improvements. This was originally proposed for no funding, and it is now proposed for full funding. The second one is the Fairmont Park recreation and lighting improvements. This was recommended for full funding with parks impact fees and remains unchanged. Project number 23 is the bridge to Bachman Elementary School. It was originally proposed for full funding with a split of general fund and impact fees. It's now proposed to be fully funded with only parks impact fees. And this is where that $240,000 of general fund money is freed up. Project number 26 is the Foothill Open Space Acquisition. This was originally proposed for full funding of just over $1 million parks impact fees and is now proposed for no funding this year. And the last change is to the 9-line trail, just a slight $1,000 adjustment to bring it in line with the 50% eligibility. Before it was receiving or recommended to receive more parks impact fees than it was eligible for. And I don't know if the administration has a recommendation for that $240,000 in general fund, but at the time of publishing, there wasn't one.
Mike?
There are a few options. So if you wanted to keep that money in parks, Parks is recommending to use that to replace pavers within parks or to upgrade playground equipment. Other options, of course, would include funding going toward street improvements in the street improvement fund that we have. And I think those would probably be the main ones that we'd look at.
Council members, any recommendations for reallocation of that $240,000? It could also drop to fund balance, correct?
Yes.
We could also just drop it to fund balance.
I think so. Actually, that's a good question. I don't know if it goes to overruns, CIP overruns, I think.
I think it's actually the council's option, so it could go
Okay.
to either.
Okay.
So I think the standard process would be that the staff would sort of apply whatever balances to the CIP cost overrun, but given the council's previous discussion in the budget about fund balance, you could also choose to allocate it there.
Any recommendations? Fund balance? Any disagreement with just letting that fall to fund balance? That $240,000? I'll remind you, our fund balance is getting increasingly tight. Although that really doesn't help it a lot with from a percentage perspective. Okay, that looks like the direction we'll go with is to let that drop to fund balance. So do we need to make a modification in the motion today, or is that part of a budget amendment?
We can double check with finance. I think that the motion would just adopt the spreadsheet, and so the unspent funds would remain unspent.
So
I
they would
believe
remain
just
in
remain
fund balance.
unspent. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you both. There'll be a motion sheet across the hall for our formal meeting this evening to adopt the proposal as presented in the spreadsheet we have in front of us.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you all very much for the helping us through this process this year. Thanks. Our next agenda item is a homeless issues update. I'm not sure who's joining us, so I'll let you introduce yourselves as you come up. Mike Reberg, are you here? Are you coming up? Mike Ackerlow? Is David Lidback available? David's out of town. Okay. So you guys are on your own? Which is fine. I'm not suggesting that's a problem, or...
Well, Mr. Chair, could I request that Sandra join us in the future?
She is supposed to be here, so
They'll go find her, okay. So, I've got 3 items that you would like to discuss. I'll just let you go through those, Mike, as you wish, and then we'll, do you have a presentation, or is it just an update, and then we'll do Q&A?
No, I think the 3 items are carryovers from last. Is that right? So
That's
one
correct.
of them was the
I have the 500 West parking lot update, the update on the administration on updates for how we're reporting campsites and campgrounds across the cities, and then the Project Homeless Connect. Those are the 3 things I have.
Let's start with Project Homeless Connect.
Okay, so this Friday is Salt Lake City's first annual Project Homeless Connect, and I am really looking forward to this day. I think it's going to be an amazing event. I'm also looking forward to being able to go back to sleep at night and not have to worry about all these little details. But right now we have about 90 different service providers who are coming in to the Salt Palace on Friday to provide services. Those range from haircuts and meditation and creative projects to mental health, medical, dental, women's services, vision, some really amazing services coming in. Moran Eye Center is coming in and doing exams, and they'll be making eyeglasses on site. Yesterday, we were notified that the county will be bringing in 300 free flu vaccinations, which is amazing. Those are really expensive, so to have that kind of donation is incredible. We have Hep A vaccinations in there as well. The point of this event is to get people immediately connected to services. And so this isn't just an informational fair, although some groups are more information because they have to do some assessment and then get people connected to services. But the overall goal is to get people connected right there to those services. So we have some housing people there who will get them into housing. We have some housing units available. If not, get them signed up for vouchers or whatever else they can to get them those services taken care of. The Veterans Administration has a whole section of their own with about 10 or 11 services just for those who have served in the military. So a lot is going on Friday. Just a kind of an overview of what this looks like. We had nearly 800 volunteers sign up for Project Homeless Connect, and we have an attrition rate of about 10 to 15%. So we just have over 700 people that will be coming starting at 6:30 in the morning and will be there till 4:30 in the afternoon, different shifts. Some will be driving vans to go around and pick people up and get them to the event. Some will be doing street outreach, walking along the streets in pairs. We have people working inside the venue. One of the interesting roles, or I think an exciting role, is to be a client guide where you are matched with a homeless client that comes through the doors and assess their services for that day, and then connect them, walk them through that venue. And the great thing about that is that client feels very important and loved and feels like somebody cares about them.
Mr. Chair? Yes. I have the opportunity to do that on
Yes.
Friday, and I thank you so much for giving us this opportunity, because
That's exciting.
we all know we really do care, but it gives us a chance, if we've got the ability time-wise, to demonstrate that, and I am thrilled that I can represent all of my colleagues,
We're
whether
excited
they
to
can
see
be
you
there or
there.
not.
Yes, we've got, and Councilmember Kitchen is also there as well. I'll just wrap up quickly. We are collecting a lot of good data through this event. We hope this will become something that is done on an annual basis. We've worked with Cicero, who you may be familiar with, and their social impact group has created an amazing database system. We'll be collecting all kinds of information about the clients, whatever we can get, plus the services that they use, so we can gauge that for next year and even refine this better. It's just been amazing of the turnout we've had from both the provider community and the volunteer and just the regular community who want to come in and participate. I think it's overwhelming. One of the questions that we asked on the volunteer registration was why they want to do this, why people want to volunteer. And the responses we got were, in many instances, really moving. We had one woman respond who had a son die from an overdose about a month ago and just felt that in her grief she needed to find a way to get back out and serve people. We've had a lot of people who say that they've experienced homelessness or that a close family member has experienced homelessness, and so they want to find a way to help others. It's just remarkable to see that people have so much that they're willing to give, especially when it's their time. And so I think Friday we are looking toward to a very successful and exciting day, and we'll get back to you on the data that we collect and what happened.
Thank you, Mike. Any questions or comments for Mike? Yes, Andrew.
I'll be there too, Mike.
Oh, good. I'm sorry. I did read all 700 volunteers, but
I am at the start of the alphabet, too. Just
That's
remember,
right.
that's how I graduated first in my class in law school.
well, yes, you're on there. Thank you for the reminder.
Mike, can you tell me, as you're targeting people to participate in the event, are you looking at people who are currently experiencing homelessness, or are you also including people who may be at risk for homelessness?
Both. We actually have we've reached out to some of the permanent supportive housing projects that we have. We have shuttles going to those to pick people up, so it's everybody.
So, Mike, and I know you're aware of this, but as we go forward in looking at how what our gaps are in service for homeless populations and homelessness risk, one of the great challenges we know is out there is that people don't typically identify at risk. They identify as homeless. And so if there's a way to capture information about how we might interface with people before they are homeless but at risk, I think that will be helpful for all of us going forward.
Okay, we do have a question on there that's an optional question about what their current status is, but hopefully to get some good data from that.
Great, thank you. So, Mike.
All right, let's talk about Fifth West parking lot or median project. As you remember, the administration asked for and you funded about $240,000 to build a secured parking facility on the medians at Fifth West between 2nd and 3rd South, actually between 3rd and 2nd South. That project was funded with the budget and was worked on, and the plan was created through July and first part of August, and we let the contract to construct the parking lot at the end of August. As you know, about the time we started that project, and the intent of the project was to create secure parking for various city employees who work in the area, but it was also to create a disruptive element for those folks, especially on the north end of the Rio Grande area, as a way to disrupt the negative behavior there. About the time we started the construction on this project, well, Operation Rio Grande just sort of occurred, and there was quite a bit of disruption that occurred naturally. And so the parking lot is near completed. There is a little bit of work to do, primarily the electronic gate, but it's in place. I think some of the original intent for it was to disrupt the activity there, but that activity is no longer there because of Operation Rio Grande. The secure parking is still essential for people down there. At some point in time, it could still be a disruptor as things maybe alter or things are scaled back a little bit with Operation Rio Grande. But what's left is the the gate itself, and other than that, it is in place and ready for operations very soon. And sorry, Sandra is not here. I had a conversation with her. We'll track her down, and maybe if there's a minute, we can bring her back up. Is that all right?
Great, yeah.
Okay.
Any questions at this point? Comments? Andrew?
There we go. As we understood it, I could be wrong, I'm not speaking for everyone here, but the primary objective was to disperse. The one less place to have problems happening on Fifth West. The secondary one was parking, because it's a temporary parking situation anyway. It's not going to last by definition, right?
That's correct.
So has there been a reevaluation about whether that's needed at this point for their primary objective? Because it sounds like it isn't, and maybe in the future it might be. I'm concerned about having a parking lot there just to have a parking lot.
Well, the parking lot is there. It will be useful for the people who need secure parking. It is the interesting timing of the situation. I don't think any of us realized Operation Rio Grande was going to occur the way it did when it did. And so we had let the contract, and we had started construction when Operation Rio Grande began. So the primary effort and desire was to do a disruptive, it was to do some disruption down there. The parking is, it's in place. So at this point in time, it still will be a useful and valuable secure parking space, and we'll just have to see what happens over time, whether things on the situation changes on Fifth West. But yeah, truly, Operation Rio Grande was a much larger disruptor than the parking lot was going to be.
Mr. Chair, may I again? Do we have any sense about ongoing costs for that parking structure in the next year and a half?
I don't. It would be minimal, if anything. I think it was designed to be. It will. There will be no need for any serious repairs or ongoing maintenance of that situation. And I think in part we used materials that aren't going to last real long. That's why we use cheaper materials like asphalt as opposed to concrete, so we could evaluate its usefulness as we move towards the permanent solution on Fifth West. So I don't envision any extra costs unless the gate, the electronic gate, malfunctions or breaks down for some reason. That's the only thing I could imagine.
Okay, thanks.
Any additional questions, comments on that? Okay, Mike, are you prepared to address the reporting for campsites around the city, or what the administration is looking for? This is the note I have. Update on administration is relying on reporting campsites, campgrounds across the city.
Yeah, so what Sandra is 10 minutes away. I apologize for her not being here. She wants to give you a briefing on the mechanism by which we are monitoring that, how communities and individuals can call in concerns and complaints about that, and the various mechanisms. She's got all that detail, and if you can give her 10 minutes when she pops in, that would be terrific. But she's prepared to do that.
What we'll do, council members, do you have any other questions related to Mike? We can ask those now, and then we have a closed session scheduled. I think we'll do that next, and then immediately after the closed session, we could address any issues with Sandra that she, or have her add anything. So are there any additional questions at this point? Looks like we're good.
Thank you.
All right, council members, we will be needing a motion to go into closed session for the for the discussion of property negotiations,
Mr. Chair, so
strategy, and advice of counsel.
Mr. Chair, so moved.
Second.
We have a motion by Charlie Luke and a second by Lisa Adams. I'll roll call this. James, Aaron, Lisa, Charlie, Derek, Andrew, and I'm also a yes. So we are now in the closed session. If you're not supposed to be here, you need to excuse yourselves probably for about 30 to 40 minutes. That's what I expect we'll be taking today. Thank you for your patience. We're going to finish up on a previous agenda item number 3, the homeless issues update. Sandra Hollins is here. Welcome, Sandra. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
The one item that we were hoping you could address for us is what the administration is doing regarding increased reporting for campsites and campgrounds across the city.
Okay.
Could you
First, I want to say I want to apologize for not being here earlier. I
And
was
actually,
in a,
Sandra, I should have you. This is really your first time at the table, isn't it?
It is.
Oh, we
It
got to
is.
figure out how to make you squirm a little bit. So, could you just take a minute, introduce yourself, talk to us a little bit about your role and what you've been working on briefly, and then we can get into this specific issue.
Absolutely. So I'm Sandra Hollins. I am the city's homeless strategist and outreach coordinator. What I've been working on is trying to do outreach and provide, number one, resources to our people in our community who are experiencing homelessness. And so, been working on the camps. I've been working with a lot of with the Salt Lake County Health Department, trying to find resources and get the camps cleaned up. I've been receiving phone calls and emails and concerns from the public regarding the homeless camps and what's going on with our homeless population.
So, Sandra, I know you're hearing this because we're all hearing this. Everyone, including people in St. George, are convinced since Operation Rio Grande that everybody's moved to their neighborhood, and there's a pretty significant uptick in activity. So, could you talk a little bit about whether or not you're seeing that as a reality and what the administration is doing around ensuring that we aren't just dispersing problems to the rest of the city?
Mr. Chair, can I tag on that if you could, my question was basically that, and I wondered what the data measurement tools are that we've been using maybe besides or including call volume and just the simple reporting, but what are the data that we're using to measure that?
Absolutely. So we have seen an increased amount of individuals who are experiencing homelessness in neighborhoods. Of course, because we had this population that was around Rio Grande and on Fifth West, and now, they've pretty much moved and they have to go somewhere. And so they are moving into the communities, they are moving into parks, they're moving along the Jordan River Trail, camping in an attempt to find somewhere to sleep at night or to live. And so, yes, they are moving. I am receiving the phone calls and the emails and the regarding this. And so what we're doing is we're directing people to use City Source to report what they're seeing in their community. This way, we're able to capture the information and the data. Sometimes I get phone calls from individuals, and so what I have been doing is taking that information and putting it into City Source also, so that we are able to have all of that information for the city in one location.
Sandra, as a follow-up to that, I'm not suggesting that this isn't happening, but there's a heightened awareness all throughout our community of people experiencing homelessness. Are you able to demonstrate that you're actually seeing an increase in the neighborhoods, or are you just aware that more people are reporting that in the neighborhoods? And I guess the example I'm using is we've always had camps occasionally along the Jordan River. We've always had them up Memory Grove and in some of our foothill areas and even some of our parks. But are you able to actually document that there is an increase in people in those locations?
In City Source, there is a way that we are able to document the location of where people are staying. And City Source graphs show that there has been an increase in different communities of the number of people since Operation Rio Grande has started, and we've started documenting it. So yes, the data does show that there is an increase in people going into the communities.
Okay, great, thanks. Andrew, did you have a question? Or Derek? I'm sorry.
Thanks for being here, Sandra. I've sent a number of folks. I've given your number out to the community, and so I appreciate you being really responsive with these issues. I have heard a couple of complaints about the City Sourced app
Okay.
I don't know if you've been receiving those complaints as well, but they vary. But primarily, what I hear on repeat is that somebody will make a complaint, log a complaint, and it will stay open indefinitely, even when the complaint is closed. Or sometimes the complaint will be closed without the issue being addressed. And so I don't know who within the administration we need to talk to, but I just want to make sure that CitySource is working appropriately for the residents.
I have not heard those complaints regarding city sources, but that don't mean that it's not happening. One of the things we have to be mindful of is that we are receiving lots of complaints, and some of them are duplicate complaints. But we are, I have been working on them as fast as I can to get them addressed. Some of them may take a little while longer to get them to get it addressed, because sometimes we have to figure out, is this public property? Is this city property? Who owns this property? Okay, we've got to now contact the property owner regarding this complaints and get something done. So because it's not closed, don't mean that we're not in the process of working on it and working to try to resolve the issue.
And
Have a follow-up on that?
consequently, would a closed one could also be an indication of a duplicate as well. If you start seeing some get closed that people are experiencing, it might just be a matter of tracking duplicate records. Is that a possibility as well?
That's a possibility,
Okay.
and we have been doing that.
Okay. Aaron.
Alternatively, for example, there's an alleyway between Lake and 800 East and about 9th and 1300 South in that area, where there's been a mattress since June. The neighbors have city-sourced it countless times, called in. It gets closed out on city-sourced. And I said, you know, that's a health department task typically to come and clean those up, and perhaps the closeout meant that the request was made to the health department. And I wondered if you could give us an idea on a general level of the success of transferring those requests to other entities where the city doesn't necessarily respond to all of the options that people can report on. Are you finding that those lines of communication or those requests are being fulfilled in a timely manner?
When I receive a request, I go into CitySource and receive a request, and I determine who it goes to, whether it's to parks or whether it's to the county health department. And when I send those to, I send an email to Jorge, who is working with this, who I've been working with the county health department, of those requests for cleanup. And so he is the one that responds, and then I coordinate with him to know when it has been done. The county has also been receiving lots of requests. And so I know that there is a list, a pretty long list of requests right now for cleanups. And so we are working, and Jorge is working, I know, as fast as he can to meet those requests and to get the areas clean.
June is a long time.
Yes, it is. It is a long time. I can follow up with him to see where we are with that, but the requests are being put in.
It brings up a question of capacity of our contract with them, or whatever means there may need to be examined for whether or not we're sufficiently enabling them to be as responsive as the needs now present. That we are having a new influx of population and a different use of alleyways and streets, parks, public restrooms, and things that are generating a lot more requests. And maybe we need to, in another session, address whether or not we are sufficiently funding those needs. I wanted to ask you, though, about how the phone calls, emails, and city-sourced requests and tips are communicated with the state team of law enforcement that's helping us. Some of us met with the state leaders about Operation Rio Grande, and when we mentioned CitySource, they'd never heard of that, and I wondered how these requests are disseminated and shared with the Highway Patrol and the other public safety bodies that are saying they want to help us in these areas outside of the Rio Grande area. but I'm not sure if I understand how they get called in to help.
Mhm. Right now, what is being used is mostly city resources. Right now, there is no direct line with the state as far as you mean with them documenting what they're seeing. I'm trying to make it.
No, I think, I don't know, I can't speak for all of us, but we've heard from the state leaders, and we heard from Lieutenant Governor Cox and Speaker Hughes as they sat at this table, that they are ready and willing to deploy those state level, the Highway Patrol and other public safety resources into our neighborhoods and into other areas of the city that are experiencing the outflux. And so to hear that there isn't a direct line of request for us to say, yes, here's where we need you, and that all of those requests are going through only our city resources, seems like there is a communication gap.
And absolutely, and it's something that we would need to work on to open those lines of communications with them to be able to get those resources.
Sandra, perhaps, and maybe this is a follow-up, there may be a disconnect between what we're hearing as representatives that Speaker Hughes is saying he's willing to bring to the table and what you're aware of in that process. And it seems logical, where you are the point person around homeless services, that if we could get you to follow up on that and see if perhaps there's a communication gap there and what we might do to improve that, I think that would be a good direction.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yes, follow.
Yes, Andrew.
As I understood, and I could be wrong, Salt Lake City Police Department, excuse me, is taking the lead and organizing with, say, Highway Patrol or the resources where to allocate need. Is that accurate?
As far as I know, that is accurate.
So when we talk about resources coming from the state, it's still funneled through the police department locally to determine where those resources go, if I understand how that works. So it seems to me that's sort of where we need to look at then, about deciding where their resources go in the city, unless I'm missing something. Is that accurate?
As far as I know, that is accurate. Much of my coordination with anything that's going on as far as criminal activities is being coordinated through the Salt Lake City Police Department.
Okay. So we may need to check that direction first before we know where the resources are and aren't going and why.
Yeah, and it's possible, I imagine, that the state is considering law enforcement issues rather than broader complaints from the community about homelessness. But we do, I think a follow-up on that connection would be really helpful, just to make sure we're all talking about the same thing. So, any other questions for Sandra at this point? Sandra, I do have just one question. Is there somebody in the administration you're working with on City Source? I don't imagine you're in there looking at programming issues. Well, maybe you are. I don't know. Maybe you do. You sit up at night in dark basement programming apps for the city?
No, I do not.
Okay, all right. So in that case, who's your support system in the city for City Source? If we are indeed seeing some, and they're probably sitting over here somewhere, but if we are seeing some concerns from residents that they may be struggling with the app, what's the resolution there?
Noel is the person that I've been working with. I'm sorry, his last name escapes me at the time. He's the person that I have been working with and talking to about how we can improve how City Source is
And I
used.
believe Noel was the originator of the entire app concept. So, okay, great. Thank you, Sandra, for your time. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair.
Yes.
It seems like there are two levels of issues here. One is just the app and some refinements to that, and then also the systems issue among the city and other entities, right? So we need to follow up with the administration at both of those levels.
I do think that an additional level, I'm sorry, Sandra, an additional level may be that I'm not confident that we were sufficiently tracking all of our reporting prior to Project Rio Grande. We are experiencing an increase in reporting, which I am not challenging, I believe is real. But how are we using that information to inform our resource needs going forward? And I think that's going to become increasingly important as we talk about budgets around how things might be inadvertently impacting neighbors and neighborhoods around the city. So figuring out how to use that tool for informing our budget discussion going forward is going to be important. Yes, Aaron.
I wanted to thank you, Sandra, for the work that you're doing. You have a great deal of experience doing a good job at this, and I think the city is lucky to have you in this position. We have hard questions today, and I think we'll continue to, but I wanted you to know how much I appreciate the work that you do. And I also want to say that I have heard from constituents, and I have personally experienced incredible service from our police department in a timely manner, recently even, and how quickly the police are being deployed and responding to calls is very comforting and encouraging. So my questions aren't because I feel like the needs aren't being served at all. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. The next item on our agenda is item number 4. It's the Salt Lake City Housing Plan. We're going to be joined by Nick Tarbett, and I think Melissa and Sean are joining us again, and Ben, too. Wow. Council members, this is a briefing related to Grow Salt Lake City. It's our 5-year housing plan, and I just wanted to set the stage a little bit before we get into this too far to let you know that we are scheduling a series of discussions through the fall on housing issues in particular as they relate to our plans. But our hope is to take action, meaning adopting or approving, modifying, adopting, or approving by December 5th. So if you keep that timeline in mind, that's where we're headed. Today, I just want to let you know this is an evolving conversation, and so the staff is expecting to take time in between meetings to do some research, to come back to you with answers on questions, to make modifications. I mean, that's all very fluid at this point. So from a leadership perspective, we have this scheduled for some discussion next week, and we will probably do that several more times through the fall. We also, remind me, Nick and Ben, we have public hearings, 2 public hearings, one on October 17th and one on November 21st that will be open to the public. They are in the process of being advertised. We're going to keep this briefing today. I think we're still on track for about a 50 to 60 minute briefing, but our goal today is to really look at the 3 goals and the objectives identified in the plan, see if you have any questions about those, any modifications, any additional information you might want to have. We're going to project that as part of the presentation, and we want to keep in mind as we're having these conversations, do these goals, objectives, statements meet our council policies? How would we like to prioritize them? And are there areas that we may want to have further discussion around? And please, if there are any questions about clarity around language, let us know that. So kind of setting that up, I'm hoping to have a discussion today, back and forth. We're keeping this a little informal with staff. I think the council staff's going to help lead us through this, but Melissa, I think, has a presentation. Is that right?
We have the same presentation from last week, so we'll just pick up sort of at goal 1.
Perfect.
And then we can have the team here lead us off, and we're
Perfect.
here to support you.
So as something to keep in mind, we've identified, council members, as we've had these conversations with staff, there are some assumptions I think that a lot of us have been making that we have policy in place around housing. An example I will give you is that we will have affordability dispersed throughout the city. We've had lots of conversations about that, but to the best of our knowledge, we don't actually have a policy statement around that. So one of the things that we want to do is to ensure that the things that you truly want to reflect in policy are in policy. And so the staff has been working really hard to track down these things that we sort of take as assumptions to see if we actually ever did a straw poll or a vote on those, or if they're things that we've just sort of generally accepted we all agree on, because it's important that we document those going forward. This is our opportunity to do that. So keep in mind that as we have some of these issues come up, we may assume that we're all on the same page, or that we have discussed this in the past. We may not have actually taken any official action on them. So we want to make sure that we do that in this process. Okay. Melissa, do you want to just kind of tell us where we are and review it really quickly, and then we'll just start the discussion from there?
Yeah, so I'm happy to just kind of set the framework for each goal and then turn it over for discussion. Goal 1, I'll just read: increase housing options, reform city practices to promote a responsive, affordable, high opportunity housing market. This goal was really framed around growth projections, the need to preserve housing and create room for new types of housing and increased types of housing that fit in communities. And so when we designed this goal, it was really around a framework of how we help the private sector do its job, and how we do that through either expedited city processes or zoning, et cetera. And we've been working very closely with planning on this effort, and they're happy to come up and share some light too if they need to. So that's the framework. So I can answer any questions, or we can just dive into objectives that the council feels.
I have a question.
So let's start with the goal, and Derek has a question. Go ahead, Derek.
Do we have some clarity on what flexible means exactly?
I think you're referring to the objective 1.1.1.
Yeah.
Develop flexible zoning tools and regulations with a focus along significant transportation routes. I will tell you that a challenge that we have when designing anything around yes, please, Nick, come to the table. The struggle we have when we design anything around zoning is that it's quite complex. It requires a really thorough public engagement process. And so when we designed the objectives and goals, we tried to keep them somewhat vague. So when we think about develop flexible zoning tools, I think it relates to zoning tools that allow us to, like the FB, the form-based code. Sorry, I'm not going to use acronyms because I'll lose that one. But Nick, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think the idea behind being more flexible when it comes to zoning is not being so rigid in those dimensional requirements that are in our ordinance. And so when it comes to housing, we have a number of what we call barriers, and those barriers were set up for a reason, right? And sometimes those reasons either are good and should maintain, and sometimes we can't find a justification for them anymore. And so that's what we want to look at and try to find ways that we can remove those barriers.
Can you give us one or two
housing.
examples?
Yeah, so one of the examples that we have is that in a lot of our zoning districts, we'll have, talking our multifamily districts, even some of our commercial districts, we'll have a minimum lot size. And what we find is that a lot of times those minimum lot sizes don't relate to our development pattern at all. So when they were created, we just can't find a reason why they were set at that value that they were set at. So for example, our RO zoning district, just off the top of my head, residential office, you would think that it's a residential zone primarily the way it's set up, but it has a minimum lot width of 100 feet. And so a lot of the lots that are zoned RO you can't get 100 feet for multifamily. So we can't get multifamily in those zones. So those would be the things that we want to look at.
Okay. So when it says modernized land use and zoning regs, this is what our definition of modern
Yeah,
is.
I mean, modernizing means something else in addition to being flexible, right? And so by that, I think what we're getting at is that a lot of our zoning ordinance really was written more as a Euclidean zone or approach to zoning, which really was based on separating uses and reducing impacts. Now, sometimes those things are good, right? And we probably still want to maintain that. But what it failed to do was take into account, in many cases, issues of scale and other compatibility related issues. And so by modernizing some of those things in some of those districts, we want to take an approach of let's not necessarily worry about how many units are on a property. Let's make sure that that building fits. And that's really what we're focused on. And that's been more of a trend in the world of zoning over the past probably we're pushing 10 to 15 years with that now.
And I think because zoning and what fits in a community will really be different community by community, we didn't outline specific codes or zoning that we would take on because they are going to be varied as we go through the 5 years.
Are you just saying that zoning should be done specifically unique to a neighborhood? I can't help but get that little dig in. We'll talk about that later. I think one of the concerns, Nick, when people see modernized our zoning is I think a lot of people go to this movement, which is happening kind of nationally, that says eliminate zoning, that zoning's a bottleneck to development or to affordability. I mean, how are you addressing that in the context of modernized?
Yeah, by no means do we envision eliminating zoning. One, state code doesn't allow us to eliminate it, right?
Well,
and it's probably not
eliminate is probably the wrong word, but to loosen up, I think is the way people talk about it.
Yeah, and I think what we're looking at is loosening up in areas where it makes sense. And so, for example, everyone's familiar with 400 South. Probably 7 or 8 years ago now, the city loosened up the zoning on 400 South. We weren't seeing a lot of change, investment even, in those properties. And so that change to make it easier to develop within reason resulted in some change. Now, obviously, we want to be nimble enough that we can go and address the outputs that we're seeing from some of those changes. But that's an example of what we mean. I think Central Ninth is probably one of the best examples that we've done over the past, as far as I can recall, of finding a way to make some zoning changes, but also maintain some of the unique assets that are in an area. And I think that taking that more precision approach is what we're looking at.
And it seems to me that one of the things that Salt Lake City has actually benefited from over time is our flexibility around unique zones and unique neighborhoods. And in fact, I would argue that the 95 rezoning actually eliminated a lot of that because it tried to create this sort of uniform zoning code that we're still recovering from. That's like we don't have neighborhoods that look all the same all throughout the city. And so going that direction has been a little problematic. But one of the challenges seems to, I think Fourth South is a great example that you brought up. Incredible activity there since we made it easier to build that kind of structure, but also a realization pretty quickly, or it seems relatively quickly, that we weren't getting exactly what we hoped for, in particular the ground level sort of activity stuff. So what's the mechanism from your perspective in planning that helps you monitor that, and how do you quickly respond to that? Because I think the challenge, I appreciate the flexibility going forward, but the challenge to that is how do you become nimble in your process? How do you stay on top of that? You typically, historically, planning's been pretty significantly backlogged when you look at, big sort of concept plans. How do you see going forward that way?
So we've been systematically, over as long as I've worked for the city, trying to address some of the unnecessary steps that we have in some of our processes that we've identified as either not really adding value to either the process we're going through or the outcome, and pulling some of those things out and trying to address those processes. So one way to look at it is that, and as a result of that, you know, we're processing we're 3 years in a row of processing a record number of planning applications without any new staff resource being thrown at it. But what we've been able to do also at the same time, if you start looking back, is that I think that we've also been able to address some master planning issues and some other things and stay on top of analyzing development to see what's happening, because we have freed up a significant amount of staff time by clarifying some of our processes. And we're still doing that. And a lot of that is our processes are changing too. So in 2010, for example, I was just looking at this for a presentation I'm doing. I think that we processed something like 40 conditional uses. Last year we did 10. And so those are things that, because of some changes in state law, a lot of the processes we were going through really weren't adding value to that. And so we were able to strip those out and find a way to still maintain our public engagement and processes. But
And actually, the TSA zone is a pretty direct response to shifting from a conditional use process to an allowed use,
Right.
and a sort of credit-based.
right, and
Based
what
use,
we're
yeah.
seeing, at least in Salt Lake City, is a shift from use-based responses to development and more of a design-based response to development. And I think that plays out in all the public engagement we do. It doesn't seem like necessarily the use is really the driving force behind some of these things. A lot of it is that design and site layout. And that's one of the areas that we're focusing on improving right now too.
Other questions about any of this goal or any of the objectives in this goal? Clerk, yes, sure, Cindy.
Just, council members, this was one that we've had a lot of public comment on and a lot of confusion about. And as the folks here have been speaking, especially Nick, I've jotted down some notes of really key concepts that would add a lot of clarity to this so that people could really understand. Not to make it really detailed or anything like that, but just to put a little more clarity so that people aren't looking at it and saying, well, it's a policy document. You said you're going to do dramatic zoning changes. Why haven't you? You know, so somehow get just a little more clarity. Does that make sense? Is it worth the time to work with planning in hand on that?
I would really like that on the land use stuff. And then I have a follow-up question as well along those lines, Cindy. In the fourth objective, you speak about high-quality data. I would like to know specific data points that we'd be looking to provide the community when we're looking at housing. I don't see that it was listed at all there. So I think adding some specifics to this objective would be helpful. Do you have some thoughts on that, Melissa?
Yeah, I think that there's a couple of things that we're working on internally in terms of data points. For example, all the data that you get through the annual housing report that you received will be public facing. We've actually put that on the website today. But then what we want to do is, as the plan gets adopted, we will look at each goal and objective and sort of create parameters and metrics around those so that we can target it over a 5-year period. So while you're sort of going through this adoption process and exploring changes, that will help inform what data points we need to put forward.
Okay.
Mr. Chair?
Lisa.
On 1.1.3, I feel like the wording in this is a little bit cart before the horse, because there are at least 3 of us who aren't really sure that we should be having ADUs throughout the city. Though I think we agree, you know, that develop measures to promote its use in the right places. And I don't really know how you address that, but I don't know that that's, I think revised the ordinance makes sense. I think the additional wording makes it sound like that's what we're prepared to do when we're still working on what that looks like.
And this is an example of something we're working on simultaneously as we're addressing this. So what I would suggest is that we just flag that, because the ADU discussion may determine the language we use there if we make modifications to that. So if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Ask.
Yes, Andrew.
1.4, the parking discussion. It sounds there that we would look at reducing parking for affordable housing developments, but it is absent any discussion about other housing developments across the city. Is that the intent?
Do you want to?
If you want to
Nick
address
is
the
eager.
intent, but
No, please go ahead.
what I can tell you
I
is
appreciate him being here.
one of the things that we are actually just kicking off in our office is a complete rewrite of our parking chapter. We have a consultant doing that, so you'll start to see a lot more over the next 3 months on that. But one of the things that we really want to do is make sure that our parking requirements aren't the driving force behind some types of development, including housing. This is particularly with multifamily, townhomes, things like that. And so we are looking at that on a citywide basis.
The language just said, it calls that affordable housing versus all housing. Is that the intent there, or?
I think from the lens that we're coming at for this housing plan, we sort of lean towards an affordable housing lens. What you might actually see based on the study may result in a more wider utilized ordinance. However, what we're focusing on and the role that we're playing with, because we're working with planning on the rewrite, is to look at how it would affect affordable housing development. So the purposes of this document and this lens, we did focus only on affordability, but that doesn't mean that as a parallel path, as planning is looking at the rewrite, it may not also affect other pieces.
The point I was asking is that by decreasing parking requirements, theoretically you increase, you decrease the cost of the building overall per unit, theoretically, right? Now, I don't know if that actually happens and how it gets passed on to the consumer, but is that what it's referring to, or are you saying there may be an incentive for affordability if we decrease parking for someone who's going to put affordability in? That's where I'm unclear about the statement here, about a general statement about increasing affordability across the board because of fewer parking restrictions, or incentivizing more affordability by decreasing the demand for that in those developments?
This is a really great question, and it actually kind of speaks a little bit to what Councilmember Mendenhall was talking about earlier. Is the path to look at incentivizing market rate developments to add affordability? And if so, how do we do that? Or is it to help existing affordability thrive and pencil better in a market that is challenging? And I think that my answer to that, and although certainly up for discussion, is as we think about that, I think it could be both. What I think we have seen and across the country is that generally we don't see market rate developers jump in for small nuggets, and parking would be one of those. So they wouldn't see that as enough of an incentive to all of a sudden say, okay, I want to do affordable housing now. The incentive usually has to be rather large. So I don't think that we would see that, but I don't think we excluded it.
Aaron?
Yeah, 2 parts on that. One is reaching back in my memory in a trip that you were on also, Stan, when we did a 1 day and a piece of a day in Portland, then we went to Seattle and toured a bunch of affordable PSH and transitional housing. And I seem to remember a program where there was a relaxation of parking requirements for these buildings, but maybe I'm making this up, but there was a binding of the operator to supply basically Hive passes for the tenants. Do y'all remember that? And if we have a Hive Pass program in place, then why wouldn't we just place that additional obvious, we need to provide transportation to people, and providing a Hive Pass is incredibly cheaper than paying for the cost of even the capital parking stalls. They're so expensive to build.
I had some thoughts too, but you said you had two parts. so I
Yeah,
don't
the other
wanna
part
interrupt you.
on that 114 is, how do we know when it makes sense? What do you mean by that?
I'll let Nick answer that.
So is this still the,
Yes,
we're still on
when,
the parking?
how do we determine when it makes sense in terms of parking?
Yeah. I think that's a good question. Part of what we look at when we're writing these organizations or regulations, is we add the geography element to it and making sure, for example, that there's other means available. And so if we were, trying to look at the parking requirements for a zone that just isn't around good transit or other alternative modes, bike lanes, et cetera, I think we'd be hard pressed to be able to really reduce those parking requirements. But we also want to say, if somebody can demonstrate that there's a market for their product in that location and they can make it work, then maybe it's okay.
I think there's a layer to this too that adds some security. And generally speaking, when a developer is going out and soliciting financing, and not that we would depend on this as a city, but just functionally speaking, lenders generally come in and look at all of those things as well, because if they don't match up, then they're not going to be able to get financing. So hopefully the city would do that in a way that it would never be a question.
So I was going to bring up the financial part, that it's difficult to get the financing if, if you aren't meeting the banker's requirements for supplying parking to make the housing successful. But there is some sort of a cultural shift in the banking world, right, about what appropriate parking per unit is.
We're seeing it. We're seeing institutions come in at 0.5 and sometimes less. The cases where we've seen that is a case-by-case basis, and it's usually based on their relationship with the developer that they've worked with extensively, which is great. And they tend to also be many of our, existing institutions that are Community Reinvestment Act focused. And so they do have an incentive to look at innovative ways to finance projects with lower parking ratios.
May I ask my other question on goal 1, which was on 112 or objective 1, about minimizing neighborhood impacts, develop those ordinances while doing that. And what are those impacts? And I know that's different for every neighborhood. I think these kind of broad statements make us feel good without actually telling us how they're going to do it and what they will measure. So I'd love your response on how do we measure and then minimize or mitigate in advance those impacts.
So something that I want you to be aware of, council members, is for everybody, that if you would like more clarity in these questions, I'm sure staff can share with you the thought process that got them to where they are now, but this is a plan that's 5 to 10 years out as well, and love you all, mean it, but some of these people might not be here then. And so if you feel strongly that you'd like some clarity or some refinement, this is the time to say that, because I think we can get more specific if you want to, and if there's some vagueness that you'd like clarity on, they can come back to us. We don't have to do it in the moment, but they can absolutely come back to us with
Then
that.
I absolutely want to add language to 114 about requiring owners or operators of affordable housing projects that have relaxed parking requirements to supply Hive Pass, or whatever language you need to call it, to every tenant.
So mine is similar to that, and it's a little different, because what I'm struggling with is, in my perfect world, there are no parking requirements. They're market driven, or there are some requirements that maybe you can get around if you provide incentives like Hive Pass or something like that. So if you remove or reduce the requirements to a point where they're okay building it for affordability, how do you come back in and either force or incentivize or provide things like car share, green bike stations, Hive Pass. How do those alternative forms of transportation getting integrated into a affordable or a market rate housing project for that matter? What are our tools for doing that? And do we require it? Do we incentivize it? Do they get points and some reduction of something if we do that? Do they get height? Do they get more unit density? What does it look like? And have we explored that? And I think for me, that's a big piece that's missing here is how do we encourage people to think out of the box? And there might be a couple of steps to that. Maybe the first is incentive and the second is requirement. I don't know, but it doesn't feel like we're getting at that benefit. And I think about the point system we use for the TSA zone and how we were able to look at it and say, well, actually, we need to review that because we're not getting what we were hoping we would get. So we changed it. We said, no, we're serious about ground floor activation. You have to change the way you do this for the points.
So I think, just if I could sort of broadly talk about one of our challenges or opportunities with this housing plan. It's a 5-year plan, and because we haven't had a housing plan in so many years, we had a sort of a lot to process, and some of the information that will lead to specifics we don't have access to yet. And so I think as we go through this process, and the council will see many specifics over the next 5 years to also be debated. And with that said, I know that we can add more clarity.
So I would like to see maybe some language in point 4 at this point, and it sounds like Councilmember Mendenhall might be in a little bit different place than me, but I certainly want to see some reference to incentives for alternative transportation modes. And if we're going to have a process that helps us identify like parking requirements, well, how is that tied to an incentive, and what could that look like? And I know that there are some developers out there who are trying to do that on their own, but we're not giving them any benefit for doing that. They're just truly trying to do it on their own.
If I could jump in and to second what you said, I think that when we're talking about housing, we need to focus on liberalizing land use and not adding too many restrictions, which is why I think the incentive program is really an important conversation for us.
So that leads to one other question I have, which I think is a conflict of sort of our goals and values. Increase housing options, reform city practices to promote a responsive, affordable, high opportunity housing market. And then talk to me about clean air and requiring connections for electric vehicles, and I'm thinking of a whole host of things where we get pushbacks from developers to say, well, now you're gonna take affordability out of it because you're requiring me to do something that runs the cost up, and we're dealing with sort of these competing objectives that are not necessarily housing related, but are livability related. And that's the one that sort of comes to my mind because we significantly modified our electric vehicle requirements based on pushback from developers who said it's going to create an affordability issue. So how do we reconcile those competing objectives in the city, not just in housing? I stumped you all. That means it was a good question.
I'll bite off a piece of that. In terms of resource allocation, in terms of space that we've got to deal with, if you go to housing conferences, if you go to ULI events, if you listen to what residential developers around the state talk about, many developers talk about the opportunity to continue building out farmland as far as the eye can see. When we think about what the impact of housing choice are, when we look at the feedback that we got from our very extensive survey of people who said they wish they could stay in the city, but their family is growing, they can't afford one of our more traditional single-family home options that are on the market. And so they have to leave the city, and now they're headed out somewhere that maybe they don't have a direct connection to the binary pathway that we have for transit in this in the county, they're headed into Salt Lake at some point during the day and back and forth. They wish they could live here, but they can't afford it. Primarily, or at least in part, because they can't find the housing type that they need to suit their current living situation, their current familial situation, their current income needs. So if we are able to provide a different product on the market, then hopefully we'll be able to draw at least that population back into the city. That reduces cars on the roads, hands down.
So I'm not sure we adequately address that in our objectives. I don't think we have adequately expressed the desire to look at or to encourage or to incentivize 3-bedroom or townhouses or sort of that other part of the market. I see some, and I think we could be a little more specific. There's some vagueness in there about diversifying it, but I think we can be more specific. I think we have enough information from our survey and from what we're hearing from developers anecdotally that people are saying, I need a family style housing unit. We recognize it's not going to be a traditional standalone single family detached, sort of small yard, but there are models like of that work for the sort of urban living that people seem to be desiring. So I'm wondering if we might add something here that would, yes, Lisa.
Along those lines, I'm looking to see where we are addressing that missing middle part, because I think that is what we want to have in there. Do you have something to say, Nick?
I was going to touch on that, and which relates back to exactly what you were saying, Stan, is that as we've analyzed our entire zoning ordinance to identify what those barriers are. And one of the things that really jumps out at us is that that townhomes, row house, et cetera, are almost zoned out of the city, even though we allow them in a lot of zones. And so that to us is one of those first kind of game-changing types of changes that we want to look at, because it does address a lot of those issues. And as we look at those, we want to find things that are helping us achieve multiple city goals, not just housing affordability or housing choice, but also some of these other things too that are out there. And so, I don't know how to recoup that in the plan, but I can tell you that you will probably see things within the next few months regarding that.
What I hear you saying, though, just to clarify, Councilmember Adams, so in 1.1.2, we talk about ordinances that promote a diverse housing stock, increase housing options, et cetera. In the explanation below the objective, it talks specifically about missing middle, but you would like to have the clarity in the objective itself.
Yeah, I would. And then further, one concern that I have is that if we push too hard on, I want to see affordability, but I'm worried if we push so hard that you've got to meet all these things that the price will go up on the market rate, and we'll make it so that we are increasing the people who are in the middle who can't afford to be there, who will be moving to the suburbs, like Sean was saying, if we don't at the same time have that missing middle. I think they've got to work in tandem, that we can't just have great affordability but then offer nothing else for the people who are because the price goes up on that building, that there's nowhere for those people to go that other than outside of the city. So we know it's like playing Tetris. It's really tricky, but I would like to see that reflected there. Thanks so much.
Derek, yeah.
And just for you, I think we keep asking for some clarity or specifics, and I realize that you were hoping to kind of go higher level on a lot of this, and then some of these, policy changes are going to be coming through the pipeline, whether it's land use or otherwise. But we have a turnover in council coming, and I want to make sure that as we have these policy discussions next year, we can point to the housing plan that we adopt in December, and so that way we don't miss anything, going forward. So I just want to be mindful of the politics, and that's kind of why we're addressing and asking for more specifics on this.
That's a great point.
And I think really, honestly, Melissa, where I'm coming from is that I think we're heading in a good direction in a lot of these conversations. I think we should include them. And I appreciate the sort of back be vague, but I think we're in a 5-year plan. On a lot of these, we've had enough discussion. I think we have some comfort level to say, no, let's include it in our actual objective.
That's great
We're
feedback.
at that place, so. And I think I'm hearing that from other council members as well.
Mr. Chair, if I may, I think as it was just demonstrated by Councilmember Adams' comment, some of the text below does fill that out. So what we could do is as we're hearing this, we can go pull some of that language up. I think that's what Melissa mentioned, but we can actively go and pull that language up.
Yep, that'd be great. Okay, we've got a couple more objectives under this goal, don't we? Or am I reading this wrong?
No, you're right.
Oh yeah. So I want to make sure we don't just think we're done with the goal. I mean,
on to
I'd
goal
like
two.
to get through goal 1 today.
Yes,
So,
there's four.
that's
There's
a goal,
four
good goal.
objectives. There's four
So-
objectives in goal 1.
And so, as you look at these other objectives, council members, any other sort of additional comments you might have?
I wondered why innovative housing solutions, and perhaps these are ones that we're familiar with, or I wondered what innovative means when we look at new ways to do things that have always needed to be done. We need to look as a body through the best use of taxpayer dollars. And I wondered if there aren't already proven development types that would be the most sound use of those dollars. So why innovative?
Well, I think they're both. We have either innovative options that are in the market that the city has been responsible for producing. Nick has already mentioned the success that we've experienced between RDA's work in Central 9 and with planning's work on the form-based code that they had there. While the housing options and the type of construction that we're seeing there, just in the housing choice sort of landscape when we talk about cottages in particular, that's proven in other markets and very innovative for Utah, very innovative for Salt Lake
You're
City.
talking about perhaps the mid-block between Jefferson and Second West and the...
Yeah, that cottage concept was the first time we've tried that, to my knowledge.
Right.
So could we read tiny houses into this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's the intent is to create a space in which we have a process where we can sort of flesh it out. So, yes.
I would also say the micro units that are going to be in the Barnes Bank development.
I wonder if we wouldn't like to call out some of these housing types.
Tiny homes in particular, I'd like to call out. I think that there's a mechanism, or that we should be looking at a mechanism in our zoning conversations that say, here in these areas, we're going to allow this, try this. There's a lot of pretty innovative stuff happening nationally about tiny homes as transitional locations as people move out of homelessness, and I'm really intrigued with that model, but we really can't do it under our existing zone. It may fit as an ADU in some locations, but I'm really thinking of more of some sort of higher concentration of tiny homes in a location.
I think it has to have its own pad and plug directly into the
And I think we need to. Yeah, we need to address that. And lot size setbacks, none of that accommodates it right now. So we wouldn't. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Nick, but I would think we would really struggle to figure out how to do a tiny home project of 10 homes somewhere. I don't know how we'd do that.
Didn't we used to call these trailer parks?
No, those are,
Well,
those are not
some tiny
fixed
homes
to a
can be on
foundation.
wheels, but the intent is not to put these on wheels.
Yeah, we would really struggle to
Yeah.
find a way to make something like that happen. So the closest example that we have are the KOA cabins. That's the closest example
Yeah.
that we have, and other places we're certainly not alone in struggling with how to do that, but
And
there
I-
are a lot of models out there that we can look at.
And I think with innovation, right, what we want to be able to have the opportunity to do with the council is give you briefings on the different types and the successes and what we think would hear. Because sometimes innovation can be great, but sometimes innovation leads to a lesson as well in learning. And so we want to mitigate that the best we can. So we will write in language giving examples of things that we would plan to explore further with the council.
So I guess what I'm getting at is there an opportunity to create a streamlined mechanism for trying innovation? Because I think one of the challenges we have is, so we've been talking about tiny homes for 4 years, and we're now just saying, well, maybe we should include those in the plan. Is it, the other example I'll give is the Mid-Street development on 7th South that we struggled with so much to see. And we really don't have a space in our zone that allows us to try something. And I'm wondering if maybe that ought to be one of those process outcomes we talk about through our planning process, to say we're not going to do it citywide. We just want to be able to streamline a process for testing and innovation. And that could be a city process.
Yeah,
That's a great
I
idea.
think that our office would absolutely be thrilled with taking on that type of.
I'm not sure if it's best in this goal or perhaps another goal, but if we could figure out a way to look at the internal process that might not just make it easier, but actually encourage
Great.
testing innovation. I
Work
think
on
there's a
that.
difference. We say, well, let's remove barriers versus let's create a path that allows us to get through it in a quicker way.
Well, isn't that the point of the I forget the call of it now, the Emory House?
Yeah, the Housing Innovation Lab. I think that's right, but I think Council Chair Penfold is correct. If planning and HAND could work together on what the process looks like, so if somebody in the community says, I have a great idea, how is that funneled? How is that taken through and vetted and brought forth so that it can either be invested in or approved through permitting?
And when I think of this, I don't think of tiny houses. I think we've had various inclinations of these ideas in the past, but they are all pad-based, right? And most of the housing innovation for cheap housing now is not tiny houses. It's pseudo-tiny houses, but different foundational kind of stuff.
Well, and it's everything from more communal type of living.
Yeah.
And that's one thing, like our zoning ordinance, we have SROs listed, but if you look at our definition of SRO, it's a studio apartment. And it just doesn't work. It's pointless.
Yeah.
We need to fix it.
So do you call that out in a separate place, or do you put zoning and building type together in a goal here? Because Stan's point was, does it go here or not? Because it's a zoning issue and it's a construction kind of issue.
We'll think through it. We'll figure it out for.
And I think what I was trying to communicate is that I think there is some innovation out there, and I'm not saying we're specifically necessarily saying, I'm not saying we need to create a space for tiny houses.
Right.
I guess what I'm saying, although personally I do think we do, but what I'm saying is we don't even have a process that allows us to try that. And I'm only using tiny houses as an example of innovation. Freight homes or modular stuff for communal living and bedrooms with a centralized kitchen for multiple units. I mean, there's several kinds of models out there that we wouldn't be able to get through a process to try it here. And rather than saying, well, we have to create a whole new zone for something that may or may not work down the road, it feels like maybe there's a way to say we could do a process that allows for a little easier experimentation. But that's...
We'll work on it.
Yeah. Okay.
Nick mentioned
Council
we had-
members, we're about out of time for tonight. Any other feedback on the goals, goal number 1, or the objectives to goal number 1? Yes, Aaron.
I'm not sure if it's into goal number 1, but I'd like it to say somewhere in here that we will be reflective of the needs assessment that has been done, that our housing goals aim to fulfill the real needs that we have done the research on and we know what they are. I'd like to tie it somehow to that, but we can talk about that.
Chair?
Yes.
Something else I think that we should probably look at adding to this first objective is utilizing city resources or assets like properties to put in there as well.
Great. Great. Does that work? You got that captured? Anything else? Andrew?
This is not one, but it ties into the Blue Ribbon Commission. In your analysis previously, you said that we lack housing in a lot of different income levels, but the greatest is 40% and below. But I think it was technically 20 to 40% AMI, if I remember correctly. Because we were short below 20, we were more short 20 to 40, and we were less short 40 to 60 and 68 and so forth.
Yeah.
The only reason I bring this up is because in the context of our affordable housing discussion the next 2 years, 1,000 units, we're focusing on 40% AMI and below. But if the point is to get the homeless housed, that's not going to help them. We're talking about 15% AMI and below for that.
Right.
And so we need to make sure we're clear when we take this housing plan and try and apply it to the Blue Ribbon Commission or somewhere else. This will not deal with that if we're hitting 30 and 40% AMI.
Right.
So I don't know if we put it in here and say clarify that piece that this isn't everything below 40, 20 to 40%. We need to be very clear when we're talking about homeless housing, the fixed income is below 20. And I think that gets lost sometimes in our discussions on this.
So Melissa, maybe the way if you let's bump this response to next week. But I'm thinking that what we might want to do, and I keep going to this, what you said, it's a 5-year plan, and to me that may allow us some more specificity on what we're currently working on. And one of those things is looking at how we're transitioning people either out of homelessness or who are at high risk of homelessness into some stability. And I think Andrew's kind of highlighted a gap for us that we have an expectation that that's happening right now. I'm not sure that all of our resources are focused on that as a priority, and that's one of the things I think we all have to talk about this later in this discussion are the priorities.
Great.
I want to question objective 1 of goal 2 entirely. Like, we haven't had a discussion about which section of the AMI we're going to prioritize. We got presented with a pretty awesome needs assessment that showed us a whole gamut of affordability needs in different sizes, and this is a policy decision that this body has not made, to my knowledge, that we're going to prioritize 40% and below. So I want to bring that up next week for question.
Okay, good. And one thing that all of you, I primarily it's going to be Sean and Melissa and probably Nick Tarbett. The information we're seeing regarding the accelerated cost of housing in comparison to the flat rate of salaries. And I think even I get this as a housing plan, and we think more construction sort of oriented and actual projects and units. But if we go forward without at least looking at a mechanism for addressing that, I think we just kick the can with our problem down the road. So even if we don't have a lot of information about that, part of our plan for the next 5 years ought to be to give some serious focus to how we adjust for that discrepancy in the flat rate of salaries, household income, and the escalating cost of housing.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you all very much for your time.
Thank you.
And we'll see you again next week, or we'll move on to goal 2. And we'll try to get through 2 and 3 next week because I want to provide a little bit of time for some feedback and modifications, in particular as we're having public hearings around this issue. All right. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much.
Council members, we're on to item number 7, which is an ordinance concerning the West Side Master Plan implementation. We'll be joined by Nick Norris, Nick Tarbett, and David Geldner. Is that right? Great. Okay.
Okay.
Who's leading this off? David?
Yes. Okay, so this was a petition generated by the Planning Commission for implementation of the West Side Master Plan, as you know, which was adopted in December 2014. Development of specific nodes was a focus of that plan. Centers of activity where we could concentrate development in the West Side was a primary objective in that plan, or primary strategy. And looking at, again, that implementation of the West Side Master Plan was creating the environment for redevelopment at community and neighborhood nodes, and providing for a variety of housing, more housing types. Again, part of also Plan Salt Lake, implementing those walkable community strategies, and again, having that neighborhood kind of growth. So this petition was for amending the zoning map designation for 81 parcels located at and around 800 South, 900 West, and 900 South, 900 West. Respectively, would be a community node at 800 South, 900 West. That's the larger of the nodes, which envisions retail and services coming from a larger area and a mix of multifamily housing and some commercial services. Then the neighborhood node would be the one centered around 900 South, 900 West. There's already a recreation node developing there, and we envision the plan envisions some small-scale commercial and residential housing in the area. There would be over time some connections between the nodes, and this project does overlap with some other city efforts, including an RDA project area around the 9 Line master plan, and the 900 West transportation improvements. So I have a map up here, and this has been slightly revised from what was presented to the Planning Commission. I'll explain that in a moment. Current zoning is a mix of RMF 35. Pardon? Okay, perfect, Nick, thank you. So the current...
He just pulled my favorite Dilbert cartoon with you. It's like, click the mouse, click, no, you're doing it wrong. It's my all-time favorite Dilbert about being supervised on computers.
Okay, so the current zoning is a mix of RMF 35, which is residential multifamily, RMF 45, residential multifamily, 45 feet, CB community business, and R1 5000, the single-family residential. And we were looking at a proposed mix of RMU 35, RMU 45, and FBUN1, the form-based code urban neighborhood 1 zone. And I'll explain the revision in a moment. There would also be some open space zoning included with this at the request of Parks, which came up recently. The proposed zoning would allow for a mix of uses, additional housing, more commercial uses, and some additional height in some cases. And it's important to note the existing zones are very strictly categorized as either CB, so they're a business zone that doesn't allow housing, or if they're RMF, they're a multifamily zone that doesn't allow some commercial. So what we're looking at is that ideal mix of kind of business and residential mix. So you have both some additional density, and then that density would support the commercial uses. In terms of the existing zoning, the existing zones really do not match the existing development. There's a large block of RMU 45 to the west of 900 West. It's been mainly developed as single-family residential. So, I'm sorry, RMF 45 is what's existing. It could be developed for more than it is now by right, but it hasn't been. It's existed as single-family residential. And so while there would be some additional development that could take place under the new proposed zoning, it isn't necessarily a lot more intense than could be developed under the existing zoning, since the property isn't maximized under the current zoning. some of the things with RMU 35 and 45, there's more of a focus on design requirements, which are one of the things as we were developing those zones, building materials, designs, things like that, and limitations when located next to single-family, two-family residential, step-back requirements, things like that. Again, non-residential uses allowed on the ground floor only in the RMU zones, and there are some landscape buffering requirements. Probably go to the next one, Nick. So originally, we had included 5 parcels owned by the Parks Department as part of kind of our FBUN1. A number of them are on Montague Avenue on the south part, and then adjacent to the end of Genesee on the north end. The Parks Department has, my understanding, talking with Parks, they've acquired those properties using open space funding, or they have plans to integrate them into the park. So their suggestion was that instead of the FBUN1, OS open space would be the appropriate zoning. And that came up latently. All the properties that are, the 5 properties were included in the original rezone area. We had just been presenting them as possibility of FBUN1.
David, on that south one, it looks like it's surrounded by open space, or 3 sides open space. And on the north one, 2.5 sides open space maybe. So it's adjacent, and it is immediately adjacent to open space land.
Correct. Correct. And the ones on the south off of Montague had some single-family housing on them that was rather in poor shape that the Parks Department purchased those property. The housing is gone now, so it's vacant land. But they talk about using it for an improved trailhead, some other things in the future.
And
Derek,
just,
did you have a question?
I don't want to jump ahead of you guys, but my question is on the property, the southwest corner of 8th South and 9th West, the Smiths.
The CN zone there? or-
How come that's the only one that you are petitioning to leave as CB?
It looks to me like that CN.
No, it's CB. It's CB.
It is
which-
CB?
Yeah, where the big
Okay,
grocery
okay.
store
Oh, I'm
is.
sorry, I'm
I
looking
think
at
it's
the wrong
primarily
corner.
because of
I apologize.
the use and the property owner. I think when we initially started talking, they just weren't interested in participating and seeing their property rezoned.
I see. So all of the property owners here are a part of this rezone?
Well, they've all been noticed and participated in the multiple outreach efforts to discuss it. But they specifically, I believe, even when we were doing the master plan, they were not interested in seeing their property rezoned.
I see. Because that would exclude housing from ever.
Well, no, CB allows multifamily housing. It doesn't allow other types of housing. And so if they ever wanted to redevelop, I think that's what they were really looking at is, we were comfortable with the known in the CB versus going to an unknown that may allow them still, but they just would
Okay.
prefer.
I just was concerned that housing would never be allowed unless it went through another rezone process. I didn't realize that multifamily housing was permitted. in s-
Multifamily
yeah.
is no, other housing types are not.
Okay.
Yeah, but you probably wouldn't get a combination of retail and housing in a CB zone.
Probably wouldn't.
Wouldn't. isn't
The
that accurate?
land values have to be pretty high. I mean,
Yeah.
the only one that we, the Mutual Beauty Supply building in 9th and 9th is the only one I can think of off the top
Okay.
of my head.
Question about design requirements in the CB versus the RMU 35. Are there design differences in requirements in those two?
Yes, we, in the CB, well, again, our requirements are mainly tied to the size of building. It has to go through the conditional building and site design review process. If it's above 7,500 square feet for a first floor, 15,000 square feet gross floor area. The RMU requirements, again, focus more on materials and other things to create a more aesthetically pleasing interface.
So this is one of the compelling reasons to change on 8th South to the RMU 35. I hate to call it a building, but there's a new apartment being built there that I have no idea what it's supposed to be, other than it's an apartment now because it has no front-facing door. The facade is bizarre. It really is, I don't know what happened here. And so I like that change. The question for me is more around the park area where on Montague, or Montague, depends on who you talk to over here, FBU in 1, right now it's, I think, R5000.
R1 5000 across Montague.
And then across the street, across 9th, the RMF 45, now RMU 45 being considered, that street right there is probably the best single-family homes in the area next to, well, probably at all, next to Genesee, perhaps. I mean, it's a beautiful set of homes. They're iconic. And none of the owners have said anything about the concern about the sort of maintaining that versus going to a more restrictive.
Actually, I think one of the property owns several properties along that strip, and he's actually expressed support to look at how could it be redeveloped to include maybe some kind of coffee shops, restaurants, things like that. And again, it is zoned already RMF 45, so it would allow for more intense development, although I acknowledge it. There are some nice existing single-family homes along there.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those rare places where it's really beautiful architecture. I hate to say that about my neighborhood, but it's rare to find intact homes like that along our road.
Yeah, and there are other options that could achieve both of those goals. So, for example, the RB zone would allow those types of, the coffee shops and things like that, and maintain that scale.
I mean, the only other concerns addressed in here about the property just west of Smith's, the little tiny RMF 45, that's like 3 or 4 homes, I forget now, and having that ability to go so high next to the open space in the park. And it sounds like the argument you're saying is it's just contiguous to the rest of that zone and it's uniform, but is that sufficient enough? Because it's all single family behind it on Indiana, or 8 South, and then open space.
Yeah, so at least for the single family zone that's to the north of those, that RMU zone has some required additional step backs and things, and they wouldn't be eligible for extra height and all of those things. So and those were put in situations to address this.
Are there similar requirements to the open space, though, step backs, or no? Just from
I don't know off the top of my head. I
No,
don't
it's,
think so. I think it's only for those low-density residential
It's for
districts.
single and two-family residential zoning.
Okay.
That you can't request the height increase if it abuts either of those zones.
Okay. The only other question was on the west side of 9 South between 8 South and 7 South. On both corners, you have a CB and another CB, and we're leaving those homes intact at R1 5000 on the west side of 9 South.
Sorry, I've lost where you were.
Across the street from the RMF 35, go west across 9th.
Oh, okay.
And there's a CB on the corner, the 7-Eleven, and the CB up top at the 7 South Apartments, and we're leaving that strip there as R1 5000. Any particular reason why? And everything else on that strip is going to be rezoned. More intensive sort of.
Honestly, I think it's more of a trying to avoid rezoning some of those R1 properties. Honestly, I think that's.
And we did keep the 2 corners by 9th South and 9th West as CN, which is the existing zoning on those 2 corners, the billboard property, and then there's a small little, I think it's a beauty shop or bodega on the other corner.
Yeah, it's just interesting that you'll find that would be the last piece of that section of kind of commercial node that will still be only residential. So it's just interesting sort of exclusion.
Any additional questions on this proposal? Council members, tonight we will be setting a date for a public hearing on Tuesday, October 17th, and our tentative action is scheduled for Tuesday, November 21st.
May I ask real quick? So the 2 open space parcels, those would be a change from what the Planning Commission had recommended. So would it be appropriate to ask for a straw poll to see if the council is okay with that so that we can include that?
5 parcels.
The 5 parcels, excuse me.
So what we're straw polling is a shift from recommendation from the Planning Commission, and those 2 green parcels would be zoned for open space. And that's different than the original proposal that went before the planning and came out of the Planning Commission. Council members, if you're okay with that, thumbs up.
There's 5.
There's 5. There's 2 up here in that corner.
Oh,
There's a
sorry.
tiny
Yeah,
sliver-
they're little tiny
tiny
pieces, yeah.
sliver there, and then off.
But they're both in those 2 areas.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you support that, thumbs up. If you're opposed, thumbs down.
Open space is almost impossible to come back from. And we have so much open space here. What we lack sometimes are their flexible uses of it. I'm not saying I wouldn't want to develop it immediately, but it's really hard to come back from that period.
I
So-
also think I would actually support the open space on the north end, those 3 parcels, but the one that's next to FBU and whatever,
So
that
let's
feels like it should maybe be. I would support that staying form-based. That whole strip.
Okay. So let's straw poll first. The original straw poll. You support this recommendation from staff or oppose it? Thumbs up if you support it. Thumbs down if you oppose it. So we have 4 supporting. Dissenting is Aaron, Derek, and Andrew.
Can I clarify something?
Yes.
Just to clarify, what the reason that staff is asking this now instead of after the public hearing is just so that they can be prepared with either motions or an ordinance. So it doesn't mean that they're going to rely on that as your answer. You'll get more information as you go through the hearing and such. But you're expressing your feelings on this gives them that opportunity to get prepared for one or the other, or in this case, probably both, just to have the options.
Okay.
So,
Thank you.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
And I would add, I think, at least speaking for myself, because I won't speak for anyone else, that I am really interested in hearing what Andrew and Derek have to say about that direction. I didn't want to just make a decision, in 3 seconds on it, but I'm very interested in why you feel like that's a good idea and exploring that a little bit. So,
Well,
I'm very open
and
to
we
that.
have a bit of a conflict because currently Parks owns that property, and there's no indication that they're interested or willing in releasing that property. So that's an issue as well.
We did suggest to them that PL, public lands, might be in a designation to consider as well, only because it does allow a little bit more development options, as we know from a fire station property that we took from OS to rezone to PL to allow like a public use.
And,
Right.
and the other zones do allow open space to occur within,
Great.
even though they may not be open space. So there might be a way to.
Yeah, that's the only piece about this, about in the future potential based on the number of park acreage there and the lack of other things we may not have. So, and flexibility, maybe making some bargains about other space we have in the community for use for parks that don't have it versus this. So,
Okay, we're going to move on. Okay, agenda item. Thank you, all you, Nick and Nick stay. Our next agenda item is item number 8. It's an ordinance for a zoning map amendment and a zoning text amendment for 2200 West. What? 2200 West. Apparently that's a place, 2200 West. And 1932 North.
So this is a request to rezone properties along 2200 West from approximately 200 North to 2100 North. The area is currently zoned business park, and the request was to rezone the properties to light manufacturing.
I'm sorry, Wayne, thanks for joining us.
Oh, well, thanks
Thank
for
you for
having
being,
me.
I didn't introduce you, so.
There are 2 petitions associated with this request. One of these was initiated by a private property owner at 1932 North 2200 West. I don't know if but it's a northern extent of the area. The other was a petition from the City Council. The overall purpose of this petition is to increase the economic development potential of the area due to its proximity to the airport and proximity to the I-215 freeway. The Planning Commission analyzed the petitions according to the applicable area master plans and also the standards of review for a zoning map amendment, recommends approval. However, they do recommend approval with an associated zoning text amendment to mitigate impacts to the existing agricultural zone properties to the north. So if you see on these maps, the one on the left is the existing zoning. One on the right is proposed, and the northern area, there's some area that's zoned Ag 2, and there's some existing agricultural uses, and most of those agricultural uses also have single-family homes on them. The current business park zoning requires a significant building and parking setback and a number of landscape improvements. The Planning Commission recommends that the zoning text for the M1 district be amended to require properties adjacent to an agricultural zone to have a 15-foot landscape building setback, a maximum building height of 30 feet at the setback line, and building height can then increase 1 foot for every foot the building is set back beyond the setback line. The purpose of that is to try to mitigate the sunlight or shadowing effect on those uses there.
So was that the primary concern, Wayne? Because I'm trying to wrap my brain around as a buffered landscape setback to an ag zone, which tends to be a field.
Yeah, it's really there is actually kind of to the north, or the ag zone property that's furthest to the east up there actually has some agricultural uses, and it's really looking at trying to,
they're growing crop.
well, it's not really crop. They actually do they train horses and shoe horses and things like that. It's not to say that there are some areas where they do grow some crops. It's pretty small agricultural operations there. But it's really, those are really long-standing residential and agricultural type uses there. They've been passed down generation to generation. And so trying to be sensitive to that and allowing for the development to happen in this area, but also recognize if we don't impose those setbacks, the M1 district actually has 0 building setback along those property lines.
So are there any other locations in the city where we might face some unintended consequences if we adopt this zoning text amendment?
This is the only place that the M1 abuts in Ag 2 or Ag 5.
Except for the Northwest Quadrant. Trick question where we're changing it to M1.
Except that there's no Ag 2 or Ag 5 out there. Right back at you.
Okay, checkmate. All right, any questions, council members?
Yeah, Mr.
Comments?
Chair.
Yeah.
The green spot that's staying in AG, that's because the property owner requested it, correct?
That's correct. The master plans actually, support eventually turning those over to probably some light manufacturing, but what the master plan says is that really should happen when the property owners are ready for it to happen, and they're not quite ready at this point.
Yeah, I know that they're quite concerned about it, so I appreciate all the work that you've put in there with the setbacks where it abuts the AG property.
Any other questions, comments? Okay. We will be setting the public hearing this evening for Tuesday, October 17th, with tentative action scheduled for November 21st. Thank you very much. You just, Wayne, you're staying. Nick leaves this time, and Wayne stays, and Doug Dancy's joining us. Is that accurate? The item number 9 is an ordinance for the rezone of 1144 West, 500 South, and 1111 West, Arapahoe. Welcome.
Thank you. I'll be pretty brief on this because basically it's a zoning ordinance cleanup. In 1995, we redid the entire city zoning code and we moved from a hand-drafted map to more computer-based. And in the process, we assigned new zoning based on parcels, and we did that looking at aerial photographs and parcel maps. Whether the mistake happened looking at the aerial or looking at or transposing to the computer, we have 2 homes adjacent to the Jordan River Parkway that have had long-standing structures on them. The one to the south is a duplex. The one on 5th South, one on Arapahoe is a duplex. The one on 5th South is a single-family home. So they're zoned open space even though they've had homes on them. So this was a cleanup petition to simply change them to residential.
And they're private property.
They are private property.
Any questions or comments? You were right, Doug. It was a short presentation, so thank you very much for that. We will again be setting the public hearing this evening in our consent agenda for October 17th with tentative action scheduled for November 21st. Thank you. We have item number 10 is an ordinance concerning Regent Street Signage Overlay District. Nick Tarbett, Michaela, are you here? Or is it Nick Norris?
Well, I don't see any of my staff here, so we're going to go ahead and start. This was...
That was said as if there were going to be some conversation tomorrow.
Well, maybe not. We'll see how well I do. So this is a proposal to create a sign overlay for Regent Street as part of a number of different objectives of the city. One is obviously to enliven Regent Street, but also to address some of the goals of the Cultural Core project. So this allows some different types of signs that aren't allowed elsewhere in the D1, different dimensions. Particularly, it allows for more of these projecting signs that are significantly taller, similar to what we see on the City Creek, and I'm going to let Anthony go over the rest of this.
Well, Anthony, you just averted an early morning meeting tomorrow morning, so...
well, that's a relief. I wasn't expecting...
We're way ahead.
I was watching upside, and I looked down, I was like, oh, Doug's up there, I better go.
Oh, there's Michaela, too. You both averted an early morning coffee conversation.
That was fast.
Yeah. So this is a... Hi, everyone. You went over it already? Okay.
Details you can add.
Well, I think that the applicant, well, yep, there she is. In terms of the specific details of what's being proposed, I may let the applicant themselves speak to that because they'll have a little bit more in-depth idea of what their goals are, if you'd like.
Yes. Who is your applicant? Could you introduce the applicant? Because I'm not familiar with who that is. And typically you give 5 minutes to talk about your application.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi, my name is Rebecca Dellis. I represent Property Reserve Inc., City Creek Reserve. And we have been working with the city to renovate the Regent Street areas. You know, the city did an amazing job with the Regent Street renovation, and we've done the east side of the street in order to kind of make that area all work out together. And what we're trying to do with this proposal is to put some sort of larger than life signs out there so people can find their way. Mostly for parking, obviously. We'll have some restaurants and things out there, but those will comply with current zoning regulations. We're looking to have more directional signage. This is where you should park on events or any time really, so that we can have some kind of more bold visuals out there.
So the Regent Street is very specifically designed and has a character, and
it does.
So how do you anticipate your application or your future? You've got a whole little.
We do. Well, not whole. It's just a little.
Just a little. Okay, good.
Just a little bit here. So, excuse me. We've actually followed the same branding guidelines that the city has already started with. Struck has been. We have hired them, and they were actually meant to be here, but we're a little early, so we're happy we were here. Oh, I'm sorry. That's tentative, really touchy. But yeah, our primary objective is to kind of keep that branding going. We're looking to honor historical downtown. We've named all of our levels in the garage by old theater names that were in that same basic region, really right downtown Salt Lake. And we want to keep within that as well to kind of support that area. And then, like I said, wayfinding is kind of our main goal there for both pedestrians and for vehicles as they come down the street. You can see there the location that we're looking at is just some blade signs where the elevator locations are, the stair locations, so that people can find their way easily. As you go underneath the Orpheum roadway, you'll see, we've got a larger sign there that we'd like to have. Sorry, there's the blade sign examples. And underneath Orpheum is where you'll see, that's our main entrance to the garage, or one of the two main entrances to the garage, and it's really hidden underneath that overhang. And so our goal is to kind of brighten that up, give it a nice something to see, but that is definitely outside of guidelines currently. And then again, over the Orpheum garage, or over the Orpheum roadway, just kind of something that highlights that this garage is where you should be.
Great. Any questions, council members?
I have a question.
Yes, Derek.
Not necessarily about this petition. Do you have any tenants lined up for?
We do. We actually have
Retail
three in the that have signed so far. We'll have a total of 7 or 8. We could have as many as 8 tenants in there, but there's one that's looking maybe at smashing 2 together. So we do have 3. We've got one that's actually, I am hoping to get my last permit issue resolved, in the next couple of days. But they are like jumping at the bit to go, and then the other 2 are in design. We're excited. We're really excited. We're hoping one of them is a food truck on, retail, and so we're kind of hoping that gives it a little mix up of something different.
Great.
Great. Thanks. Yeah, Aaron.
I look forward to those being occupied too, and my new favorite restaurants on that street. So I loved hanging out there, but it is a bit, there's a theme to it, and I could see where the parking, I completely agree that we need some clarity on where those opportunities to park are. But I wouldn't want these signs to outshine the new businesses coming in and the business that exists there today, and their sign allowances are much more strict than this. So,
sorry, I'm going to go back to this one. So we are proposing for those tenants. I've actually run that through the zoning group already to show them. This sign is the same size and idea of what their blade sign can be. So
what
it would
is
be
that size?
And
is it a penny or a pizza?
it's more like a pizza, maybe a little bit
A
bigger. It's 2
large
feet
family
tall.
pizza. Is what
Yeah,
it is.
it is
So
a
now go
large
back-
family pizza.
Might be an
yeah.
extra
So
large family
as you
pizza.
walk down the street, north to south, south to north, either way, you'll get that blade coming out at you because it is a really narrow area. Over each door or opening, they'll be allowed to have one that's a flat sign that's technically their major sign, but that blade, I think, is really going to help them. And actually, I think we've actually got those hung off the canopies so that you can see them a little farther out from the building so that you can see it as you're walking down the street. And then they'll get one over their door as well.
Will you go to the park signs now?
I'm sorry, that one there?
Yeah, that one.
Yes.
And 18 square feet.
Yeah, it's
So
height-wise.
2 by 9 or what?
Height-wise, it's I think it's 8 feet tall. Yeah, 8 feet tall, and then it sticks out from the building, and it kind of has that little lilt to it to give it a little something. But
That is quite large.
it is very large.
Very
Well,
large.
It's smaller than the one we originally started with.
That doesn't make me
But
feel
it is
any
large,
better.
yeah.
Why so big?
I think part of it is the size of the building. The building is 10 stories tall.
It
so
is, but
it feels a little bit small. And like you say, it's a little, and we wanted something, like you can see, we were kind of going for historic, and those historic marquee signs were very, very large and kind of drew your eye to them, and we're kind of hoping to achieve the same sense of pizzazz.
We are, but then we're putting the extra large pizzas for the actual businesses. So
Well, for the blade, yes, but the other will be normal.
But those are on the building facade. So when you're looking down Regent Street, the parking sign would be 4 times bigger than the height of any of the business signs.
Yes.
And that's just excessive to me.
And part of it is there are current regulations that keep them in that range. So if you want, we could tell them they can have bigger, but that is outside your current
Yeah,
zoning.
you're a very sharp
proposal.
property manager that you just suggested modifying all the other zoning ordinance
I'm
to allow
simply
bigger
saying
signs.
that that is already out there.
Excuse me, but the proposal for the smaller blade signs, the round ones, is part of this application, is it not?
The blade sign, well, I actually argue that the blade sign says that you can only, currently the zoning requirement says you can have a blade sign at every entrance. I argue actually that I meet that code because I'm putting one at every elevator and one at the stair, but the zoning team, Alan Hardman and Greg Mikkelash, have told me that they don't know that they agree and they'd like to let this go through before they'll allow me to do that. So they're saying, so anyway, you get a blade sign per entrance plus 1 flat sign.
Now, so go back to your signs for me, if you would. And this application is for those 2 signs.
And this is really more of a, this is where the garage is.
Right, and then is it also for the pizza sign? Sorry, I don't know what else to call it now.
You're fine. The blade sign?
Right.
Yes. Yes, we would propose that all of them be included in this overlay.
So my question is, are those big enough? And is the parking sign too big? Is the proportion here that we're considering out of whack? I mean, can you imagine an 8-foot tall parking sign and then the size of trying to read what the restaurant is down the street in comparison? I don't know.
I think in some ways we're hoping it will be actually directional signage for them in some ways, so that they can say, we're located in the Regent Street parking, park there, walk downstairs, and you'll see where we're located. And then we will have wayfinding signs. We're working on those as well that are kind of attached to the building that say, go this way for this restaurant, this way for that restaurant. But those also fall within regulation.
For my friends in planning, Anthony and Michaela, what about applying these allowances? Should we pass the blade sign, especially for the businesses? How about applying that to the retail and restaurant spaces on the west side of the street?
My understanding is the blade signs are already allowed under our existing code.
Yes.
And we're not
however,
being requested a size change at all? There's no
I think
change?
without a size change. However, sounds like the interpretation through permitting was they aren't sure it's allowed on an exit and entrance to a parking garage. So that's why it got included here. Am I saying that right?
Yes. That was kind of the argument they had back to me, is they thought, well, since it's already included, they'd like to wait for that to go through. I think that when I read the code, I read that you can have one at every entrance. And for me, each
entrance to
elevator,
a
lobby,
parking.
and a stair should be an entrance to the garage. But they wanted me to wait for this.
Does that answer your question?
So the blade
Yes,
sign fits
about-
within current regulation.
About the other side of the street. But
Yeah.
And I think, if I
Were
may.
these, you mentioned that you use the same consultants who designed the streetscape. Is that correct?
The signage that the city has put out there already, yes, Struck
And,
has done
and
both
they
of them.
were the ones who designed this for you? Okay, so I'm just suggesting
and he
that
is
there
here.
might be some, who's saying that?
Matt with Struck is here as
Matt,
well.
come on up, come on, Matt, was that?
And it sounds like, Aaron, they had a larger proposal and Struck brought them down on the parking sign. So
He actually brought it down,
yeah.
but
I think that's somewhat irrelevant to me. The point of parking is convenience, and I get that we need wayfinding for that, but 8 feet tall is huge.
So
That's a huge sign.
Matt, I'm going to ask now. Matt was part of the team that designed our Regent Street infrastructure.
Yes, that's correct.
So speak to the concerns, if you can, about size of the parking sign in particular, or the park sign.
Sure. Well, the city and the RDA asked us to create this lively theater district behind the brand new theater. And one of those things that when you close your eyes and you imagine a theater district are kind of large, lively signs. And if you look at the history of this block, at one time it was filled with signs like that aren't just signs, they're pieces of art as well.
Matt, can you pull the mic to you, your mouth? Thank you.
That better?
Yeah.
Okay. So that was our goal. We wanted to create signs that look like interesting artistic people live in Salt Lake instead of kind of having a lot of beige streets like we have now.
But it says park.
Yep. But it says park in an interesting way.
Oh my gosh. I can't believe we're having this
And I think
conversation.
there's actually a slight misunderstanding
That's
about
interesting,
the size.
people.
Matt, can you speak to the size, Matt?
Actually, a misunderstanding about the
You're right.
size.
I'm
It's-
looking at the sign on the other side, sorry.
The blade
I'm
that
sorry,
sticks
what?
up that says park, it's only like 5 feet tall and about 2 feet wide. So that's how you arrive
Thank you.
at the square
Sorry,
footage.
it's only 5 feet tall.
That's still,
Thinking it was the size of Lagoon on
No.
roller coaster.
No, we had that earlier.
did have that.
And we provided.
You scaled it back.
So now this sign is meant to evoke a theater marquee. So it's very wide and horizontal. It curves on the ends like a theater marquee. It has a nice trim line of neon, and then the letters are placed on it like you would a movie title. So tying
helped.
into
3
the
feet made a
beautiful theater on
difference.
the other side of the street.
So glad
Okay,
Matt was
thank
here
you,
for that.
thank you, Matt, for that clarification. I appreciate it.
Keep in mind that you need to see this from Third South as well.
I was gonna
Or I'm
say,
sorry, Second South as well as First South.
do you have an elevation and a sign to see it from where you would have to turn in?
Yep, hang on, let me, sorry, find that.
And another thing,
It would sit here.
Yeah.
So this is north, south here, and then this is Orpheum Avenue, and the sign goes across here, and then I think it's actually about 2/3 down to the south, wasn't it? Oh, yeah, it's right here. So this here goes right above Orpheum.
Well, that car is sitting on Orpheum.
I was just thinking from the perspective of somebody on Second South or First South who's looking down Regent Street, what's the perspective you're going to see? Because that for me as a driver, that's what matters. Is it going to be effective to get me to see it, and does it not overwhelm the rest of what's around it?
And
It's hard to see from these kind of photos.
It is, and I apologize we don't have that perspective, but having walked through, I do believe actually that if we went any smaller, you wouldn't see it from Second South. It is sitting farther toward the north, and I think you would lose it at that point. So I do think it's sized so that you can see it from both ends. Well, mostly the south, even then maybe on the small side.
It's also important to remember that it's almost a 400-foot long building. So a sign of this size is actually kind of small for a building that size.
And it started bigger.
It started a lot bigger.
Well, clearly we've made the determination this evening that size does matter, so I could not resist. The briefing is today. The public hearing is on our consent agenda to set for Tuesday, October 17th, and then tentative decision scheduled for the 21st. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.
That was kind of fun, actually, so thank you. Our last item on our agenda before announcements is item number 11. It's the Station Center Area Zoning Map Amendment. Looks like we have the same team again. So let's see if controversy follows you or just Regent Street.
So this is an area rezone. It was initiated by the mayor a while back to facilitate the redevelopment of the station center area, which is one of the projects of the redevelopment agency. Oh, I guess I have my mouse here. So the area is roughly bound by 4th South, 5th West, 2nd South, and then the Intermodal Transportation Center. This is just an illustration from the downtown. It's supported by a number of the city's adopted master plans, including the downtown master plan. This is an illustration of what the site could be redeveloped as, whether or not it's not a specific redevelopment plan. The parcels are proposing to be rezoned to GMU, and they're currently zoned D3 and general commercial. Happy to answer any kind of more specific questions you might have.
Questions?
We
Yes.
don't own all of these properties.
That is correct.
That's correct.
You want to give us any feedback on the other owners' conversations with the timing of the rezone and
I
projects?
haven't heard from any of them specifically reaching out to me, whether they've been in conversations with the RDA or another city agency. If they have been, I'm not privy to it.
And they would have been notified through the planning commission process.
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
And I'm assuming one of the goals is to not have split zoning?
Correct.
So that we can make it.
Yeah.
Okay. Other questions or comments, concerns? Okay, as this is a rezoning petition, we are setting the date this evening for a public hearing on October 17th and tentatively action on November 21st. Thank you both very much. Thank you, everybody. Yeah, I'll talk to you later. Never mind. Go ahead. That concludes our scheduled agenda items. We do have a couple of announcements, so I'll turn time over to Cindy Guest Jensen.
Okay, timely that you had a sign discussion a moment ago. Your first announcement is about the sign overlay text amendment that you approved recently for the Vivint Arena. There were two parts to this petition, and this is one of those mistakes that happens when we're rushing. We rushed and did not realize that we should have had two separate items on your agenda for two separate votes with two separate ordinances. So the petitioner is legally entitled to an answer from the legislative body on their petition that they have filed. So the Vivint Arena Block piece of this has been completed. The question is, that's remaining is their practice facility. So we have created an expedited timeline here with a briefing October 17th, a set date October 17th, a public hearing November 28th, and potential action on December 5th. There is something I should mention, and that is that there has been a very long history of discussion about large signage, any kind of signage that abuts the a highway or a busy road. And I think it will be natural for that discussion to come up in relation to this sign. I think it's a little bit of a different conversation than the arena signage was. So you may want to add into this an extra briefing or something like that. So by giving you this expedited schedule, we are not intending to inadvertently limit your discussion time or anything like that. You'll want to probably have some feedback from planning. So.
Any questions about that?
Yeah, I just have a question. Since this is an on-premise sign, I think that we need to make sure that we separate the on-premise from off-premise discussion. I think that moving forward, because I think that's what bogged it down. I don't know how long ago it was that they had that last discussion in regards to
Yeah, I agree,
signs.
but it's a little unique because it is truly a billboard-sized sign on premise
Is
along the freeway.
on premise.
Yeah, no, it does meet that
Right.
definition. Huh. Okay. You had another. Any concerns, questions? You're okay moving forward?
And then if you run into a situation in the middle of it where you'd like to get a little more information or whatever, you can just add a briefing. There's room for that. Okay. Then next item is the Golf Enterprise Fund. We are at that point during the year where we
You'll love this announcement. I love this announcement. Duh.
So for the public, what we're talking about is whether we can conclude the Golf Enterprise Fund discussion before year end, or whether it needs to be started with a newly formulated whatever council that will be in office as of January. And the recommendation from the chair and vice chair is to begin that the chair, excuse me, is to begin that conversation with the new council.
Just
as
thinking
opposed to
about
partially
staff and timing, I truly don't want all of you to have that conversation twice. So I'm really only thinking of you. Mhm.
Twice, it's been like 8 times.
So it'll be in January. Okay, good. Good.
Okay.
All right, that's
Thank you.
great. All right, that concludes our briefing agenda for today. Council members, I do want to mention, you notice a lot of those briefings today have schedules for the 17th and then action later. That will seem like a lot of public hearings, but I don't expect as much engagement on those issues that we saw today as we have had for last week and tonight. So there you go. James, I think, is in charge this evening across the hall, and we'll see you there at 7 o'clock. You are. Okay. Thank you all.